I'm doing the sermon today. Hey. Since I've never done that, I don't know where I'm going to do it from, but this is what it looks like from here. Hang on a second. Or from here. Maybe. Sure. Maybe not. Maybe I'll go back over here. No. I'll stay here. Some time ago, we were in the position where we didn't always, we didn't have a permanent pastor. We didn't always know who was going to be in the pulpit on Sunday. And being the elder who was responsible for getting someone to come and preach, and not always being certain that the elderly, esteemed minister that we had engaged from Worcester, might come if there was a snowstorm. That we might have nobody here to do the service or do a sermon. I kind of kept some thoughts together just in case that happened. So that's what I'm going to give you today. And the first part of it is based at least on some comments some thoughts that my dad gave me a long time ago about the feeding of the 5,000, that particular miracle. And so I guess my sermon is, what is a miracle? What is a miracle anyway? And before I get well and truly started, this is just my thoughts. This is not my attempt to tell all of you that this is how all miracles work. I don't know that. And I know that people have their own particular ideas on how those things work. I know that I do, but this is just my thoughts. So it's a big day in the little village. That hot new preacher, Jesus from Nazareth, is in town. He's in the area. He's going to preach, and everybody's all excited about it. They all want to hear him talk. And it becomes known that a number of villages are all going to go to a remote place in order to hear him speak in a hot, dry, arid land. And the fun begins. Most people, on hearing that they are going to go out into the middle of the wilderness for quite a time, apparently Jesus could preach a little bit longer than a Presbyterian minister, will prepare. They'll get everything they can. My wife, God bless her, on hearing that she's going to go 2 streets away for a potluck, is incapable of going without enough meatloaf or taco salad or ramen noodle salad to feed her regiment. Many people will simply prepare. There'll be old dad, he'll be, okay, honey, I want you to get that basket full of food, and Junior, I want you to get some of that bread and that fish, and Missy, head off to the well and get some water, so that, of course, by the time he gets done with all of this, he turns around and there's his wife standing there. She's all ready to go. That's how most people will prepare. Some people will head out with a little bit. And some people, for whatever reason, will go out in the middle of a hot, dry area with little or nothing. Human sensibilities have changed, over the years about many things, but basic human nature, I think, has not. 8 or 9 years ago, we went to the Grand Canyon and a number of other places in Bryce Canyon. We went to Canyonlands, the Arch in Utah, and at every trailhead, there's a sign, a very prominent sign that tells you if you're going to go on this walk, how long it is, and what you need to take as far as water, or maybe even food, and warning you of the dangers of what will happen if you don't. And they're serious. How much water did we give away to people who went out? Gallons of water. We even had to send in Andrew and another young guy and one of our adults in our party to rescue somebody who went on a walk in the Canyonlands and went down unconscious and help him get out. And we had to do that because the rangers were in another park helping somebody else do the same thing that they had done. People will do it. So the day grows long, and Jesus is preaching, and everybody is starting to get nervous because it's getting late. It becomes apparent that some people might be in danger, maybe, of not making it home. And I think the account in the Bible says that many people were in danger of being famished. And I believe that famished does not mean I'd really like a snack, or I'm a little hungry. I think famished means in danger, of your life, or for lack of food. And it was obvious even to the apostles that there was this great difficulty, and they went to Jesus and they said, "What are we going to do? We have all of these people, and we can't feed them, and there are no villages nearby, and we don't have enough money to buy the food if we had it, so what are we going to do?" Blah, blah, blah. Well, Jesus calmed everybody down. He broke people up into small groups of 50, and had them all sit down and relax, so that everybody was in a smaller group. They're not looking at this huge mob of thousands of people. And then Andrew finds the boy. We don't get a name, he's just the boy, and he has a basket of fish and bread. Now, the Bible makes no mention of parents. They don't mention that they're there, but you can feel them in the account. I mean, how likely is it that this young guy is going to be out there in the middle of nowhere without his parents? So they probably give him some food to share, seeing that this is, what difficulty everyone is in, and give him the basket. They want him to grow up the right way, generous spirit, and they give it to him and send him off to Jesus to see what he can do with it. Okay, take this basket to Jesus. Yes, that guy over there, the one who's been talking. Take it, go. So off he goes, and this is just the thing that Jesus is looking for. He takes the basket, and in the sight of everyone, blesses it, and begins to share it out. This is kind of the point where I'm doing a little bit of guessing, and where it gets a little tricky. But I'm supposing that the food was there. That people were looking around, especially the ones who had brought nothing or had brought very little and were now out, looking around at their neighbors to see, can I count on some generosity? And the people who brought plenty, thinking, I have enough for my family. This is for my family. So I'm doing a little bit of supposing here. At the end, of course, when the food began to be shared, there was enough for leftovers. Many baskets of food were collected. So I'm supposing that the food was there. The desire to share it and the inclination to do it was not at first. And that the blessing of the food and the sharing out by Jesus unleashed this little miracle. We were talking at Brown Bag some number of years ago about what sheds light on the Bible, what enlightens things that happen in the Bible. And for some guys it was a flash of insight. For others it was a personal experience or a scene from a movie. I'm not sure I've talked this long ever in my life at one time. For me, what sheds light often is history. I read a lot of history, and there's an event that I've read a lot about that I think sheds light on the feeding of the 5,000, and that is the Berlin airlift of 1948 and 49. Now, this is an event that, of course, a long time ago, but many of our members perhaps will remember. I was born in 1952, so I was -4 years old when this happened. but I've read a lot about it. And there were some events in that kind of shed light on the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. This is kind of the situation at the time. This is only 3 years after the end of World War II. The war ended in 1945, and in 1948, Germany was a beaten, bombed-out country, occupied by the armies that had beaten them in World War II, and they didn't like it. They were not in control of very much. They had to ask permission to do whatever they wanted to do. The country was divided into 4 zones between the Soviets, the Russians. The Americans occupied another zone. The British and the French each had an area of Germany that they controlled. And the city of Berlin itself, likewise, was also divided into 4 sectors between the Russians, Americans, French, and British. And it was a very difficult time for everybody. All these foreign armies are occupying, the Germans' country, and like I said, they didn't like it. Well, the Russians, the city of Berlin itself is deep inside the Russian zone, and in order to get, supplies and stuff, for the British, the French, and the Americans to get it to Berlin, they had to go through Russian territory to do it. And there was a highway, there was a railroad, and a couple of canals, and that was it. All of our supplies had to come in that way. Well, the Russians wanted the Allies out, and to do it, they decided that they would blockade the city. They cut off the access to the rail line, they cut off the road, and now, the Americans, British, and French could no longer bring in food, could no longer bring in supplies, and everybody sat down to figure out, well, what are we going to do about this? And the suggestions ranged from, let's just pull out and leave the West Berliners to the Russians, all the way up to, let's start World War III. And not very many people were of a mind to start a war in favor of to help out the Germans. There were, and as food began to grow short, and the Germans began scrounging around in the garbage cans of the American and British and French soldiers, and they were prevented from doing that, by not because nobody was willing to do anything for the Germans, and the Germans in their measure also returned this spirit with animus. American soldiers would go into a restaurant or a beer hall, and all the German guys would get up and walk away or leave if it was a small enough thing. But while everybody was trying to figure out what are we going to do about this, the American commander decided, well, at least we can run out of food less quickly, so let's start flying, food into the city. The Berlin airlift has gone down in history as being one of the great humanitarian efforts of all time. Well, it certainly didn't start that way. It was just a stopgap measure to try and run out of food less quickly. And so more and more planes started being drawn in. Planes began to crash. American and British pilots began dying. There would be accidents on the runways. Overloaded planes would land in bad weather and crash and burn. And the Germans began to wonder about, look at this, look at these guys. I mean, they bombed us into almost out of existence, 3 or 4 years ago, and now they're dying trying to feed us. And they began to set up little memorials, the way that you see along the side of the road where there's an accident and someone has died. Well, the Germans began to do that, began to appreciate, this is kind of an amazing thing that's happening here. And it all might have gone along and everything might have worked out well in the end, but for a singular event that occurred. There was a pilot named Harold Halverson, who got drawn into this as a pilot, and one day decided when he was on the ground and his plane was being unloaded, he decided to take a Jeep and go down to the end of the runway. Down at the end of the runway was a set of apartment buildings, very tall, like 6, 7, 8 stories. And an American planes flying into Tempelhof Airport actually had to go down, land between these buildings, just kind of a terrifying thing for these pilots who are used to lots of open airspace. And he noticed that there were always kids down there. And so they went down and they pulled up and they barbed wire between the apartments and the airport. Pilots stood there looking at the German kids, and the kids are standing there looking back. And looked at each other for a couple minutes, and they turned to go. And Halverson, for what reason, turned around, took the candy out of his pocket, and handed it through the wire. And they all watched what happened next in kind of some amazement. They thought the older kids, might hog everything, but on the contrary, what they did was they divided everything up as evenly as they could among all of the younger kids around. The older kids took charge, and they broke everything up. They even took the gum wrappers and tore them in pieces and handed those around to everybody so that they could, just lick off that sort of sugary dust, off the inside of the wrapper. And this just impressed Halverson mightily, and he said, "Well, tomorrow I will bring some more, and we'll drop it out of the plane so that you can get it as we're landing." And I said, "Well, how are we going to know that it's you? Because at this point there were planes flying in and out every minute and a half, day and night." And he said, "Well, this is what I'll do. As I'm coming in, I'll rock the plane back and forth. I'll wiggle the wings, and you'll know that it's me." And so the next day, that's what he did. He got a hold of more candy, and they made a little parachute out of a handkerchief, and they put it in a bag, and as he was landing, he pushed it out the window, and down came the candy. And to make a long story short, this whole thing just grew absolutely out of bounds, and it was even encouraged and aided by the authorities, because they saw the response of the people of Berlin to this act of generosity. Pretty soon planes were dropping candy and little parachutes, over city parks, over wide spots of roads near the airport. Anywhere in, kids were being dragged by their parents, down to the airfield, looking for anybody in a uniform to thank for the simple act of having candy given to them by a former enemy. Some of these kids had never seen candy. They had seen the worst days of World War II. And the people in West Berlin who were trying to establish a democratic form of government began to take hope that the Americans and the British and the French were going to stick around and try and help them. And I guess, to make a long story short, this temporary stopgap became the solution. It became impossible to think of giving up on them. One kid even wrote Halverson a letter in kind of fractured English and said, I never get any candy. The bigger kids get it, and you never drop it near my house. Can you please drop me some candy? And he wrote directions. You fly along this canal to this place, and you turn left on this main street, and I'm right on the first corner. And Halverson actually attempted to do this, and he got a letter back sometime later and said, you missed me. I still didn't get any candy. How did you guys win the war anyway? So he actually made sure that this guy, got, this little kid got some candy. And the airlift went along for pretty close to a year. And this became a huge effort. More and more planes, more and more equipment, more and more pilots, more supplies were brought in, and they helped the people of West Berlin to maintain the freedom that they did have, and gave them assurance that, that the Americans and British were not going to pull out and leave them to the Russians, which they really did not want to see happen. In the days and weeks following the events of September of 9/11, September 11th, 2001, there were a number of different types of observances the world around. Minutes of silence, days when shops were closed, rallies attended by anywhere from several hundred up to 1,000 people or so. In the city of Berlin, the rally was attended by a crowd too large to estimate, upwards of several 100,000 people. Not all of them really quite aware why they were there, but there were a number of people in the crowd circulating around who told them the story of the days when they were surrounded by enemies and Allied planes thundered in overhead, bringing food, supplies, and hope. It can be argued, I guess, that sooner or later the Americans, British, and Germans were going to get along with common interests, but this act of these pilots, who came to be called candy bombers, you get that, candy bombers. The determination to feed the people touched the minds of the Germans. Well, this candy bombing touched the hearts of everyone. One man with a handful of candy, one kid with a basket of fish and bread. What is a miracle anyway?